It was the night before Halloween, and I sat alone in my room, the faint flicker of my laptop screen casting eerie shadows on the walls. My parents were out at some Halloween party, leaving me to watch the house. Normally, I wouldn't have cared. I was 17, old enough to be on my own. But something about tonight felt off. We'd only moved into this old house a few months ago. It was one of those rundown places at the edge of town that people whispered about, always looking like it had something lurking in the shadows. The kind of place that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were completely alone. I hated it, but there was no point in complaining to my parents. They were thrilled to have found something affordable in this quiet neighborhood. A creaking sound echoed from the hallway, snapping me out of my thoughts. I froze, staring at the closed door. My heart began to pound, each beat growing louder as I strained to listen. The house was always settling, creaking at odd times. But this was different. The sound was closer, deliberate. I tried to shake off the unease and forced myself to focus on my laptop. Just the wind, I told myself. This place was ancient, bound to make noises. I resumed scrolling through Reddit, desperate to distract myself, but my gut wouldn't let me forget the sound. Another creak. This time it was unmistakable. It wasn't just the house settling. It was footsteps. Slowly I turned my head to the door. My breath hitched. The handle moved, just a slight twitch, but enough to make my stomach drop. My parents weren't supposed to be back for hours. I stood up, my chair scraping against the wooden floor. The sound echoed louder than it should have, and I instantly regretted making noise. For a moment I considered locking the door, but some deep-rooted instinct told me that wouldn't help. Whatever was out there, it wasn't afraid of locks. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed my phone and moved toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Silence. My mind was racing, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My phone buzzed in my hand, the sudden vibration making me jump. A text from my mom. "Hope you're having a quiet night. We'll be late. Don't wait up." I didn't reply. My hands were shaking too much to type. Taking a deep breath, I slowly turned the knob and opened the door just a crack, peering into the dark hallway. Nothing. I exhaled, my breath catching on the edge of a nervous laugh. I'm freaking out over nothing, I thought, but as I stepped into the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt thick, like the house was holding its breath. I decided to check downstairs. Maybe there was something loose, something making noise in the wind. I grabbed a flashlight from my desk, the only thing I had for protection, and made my way down the creaky steps. Each step sounded louder than it should have, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. My stomach churned with every noise. When I reached the bottom, I scanned the living room, casting the beam of the flashlight around. Everything looked normal. The old couch was in its usual spot. The clock on the mantel ticked away, and the front door was securely locked. I sighed, feeling a bit of relief creep in. Maybe it really was just the wind. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate tap coming from the kitchen. Tap, tap, tap. My heart dropped to my stomach. I swallowed, tightening my grip on the flashlight as I turned toward the sound. The kitchen was down a narrow hallway at the back of the house, and every step toward it felt like a journey through molasses. My feet felt heavy, and my throat tightened with dread. As I reached the kitchen doorway, I hesitated, listening. The tapping had stopped, but the tension in the air hadn't gone anywhere. Slowly, I stepped into the kitchen, the flashlight sweeping across the countertops and cabinets. Then I saw it. The back door, the one we never used, was cracked open, just slightly. Panic surged through me. I hadn't opened that door. We always kept it locked. My mouth went dry and my skin prickled with cold fear. My mind raced. Had someone gotten inside? But I hadn't heard anyone enter or leave. I moved toward the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The wind outside picked up, making the door creak open just a little more. As I reached for the handle to close it, a sound stopped me in my tracks. Whispering. Low, hushed voices. I froze, listening. The whispers weren't coming from outside. They were coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, my heart hammering so loudly it drowned out everything else. The beam of my flashlight fell on the far corner of the kitchen, where a shadow flickered. Something crouching, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was paralyzed with terror. The shadow shifted, rising slowly, revealing a figure that was too tall, too wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its head tilted at an impossible angle, like it was studying me. And then, its eyes. Glowing, pale eyes that locked onto mine with a hunger I could feel deep in my bones. I stumbled backward, my legs finally responding, but my body was numb with fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away as the thing took a step forward, its movement slow, deliberate, like it was savoring every second of my terror. My back hit the counter, and I realized I had nowhere to go. The door was right behind me, but that thing was between me and any chance of escape. I fumbled with my phone, trying to dial 911, but my hands were shaking so violently I dropped it. The screen shattered on the tile floor with a loud crack. The creature paused, its head tilting again, as if amused by my pathetic attempt to flee. I knew in that moment that it wasn't human. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in this world. And then it spoke, in a voice that wasn't quite a whisper, but more of a rasp. It said my name. My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, the flashlight clattering beside me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was trapped in a nightmare that felt far too real. It took another step, looming over me now, its breath cold against my skin. My vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its hand reaching for me, long, bony fingers stretching out, ready to pull me into the shadows. When I woke up, the house was silent again. My parents found me lying in the kitchen hours later, the back door wide open. I tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't believe me. No one did. But I know what I saw, and I'm not staying in this house another night. Halloween was always my favorite time of year. Every October, the streets of our small town came alive with glowing jack-o'-lanterns and kids running door to door in their costumes. This year was different, though. It would be my first Halloween without my best friend, Josh. Josh had moved to another state over the summer, and I wasn't handling it well. We'd done everything together since we were kids. Halloween was our thing. We had this tradition of going out trick-or-treating even though we were getting too old for it. It was never about the candy. It was just about the thrill of the night, the spooky atmosphere, and seeing who could outscare the other. But with him gone, I wasn't feeling up to it this year. My parents were throwing a Halloween party at our house, which left me stuck babysitting my little sister, Emma. She was only 8 and couldn't go out alone, so I got the job of taking her trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. I wasn't excited, but I figured a walk around town would at least distract me from how much I missed Josh. Emma was dressed as a witch, complete with a crooked hat and face paint I helped her with, and I, in typical 17-year-old fashion, didn't bother with a costume. I just threw on my hoodie, hands stuffed into the pockets, and trailed behind her as she bounced from house to house, collecting candy with her friends. The night started off fine. The streets were crowded with kids and parents, decorations hanging from every porch. The warm glow of orange lights and the smell of fallen leaves made everything feel festive, but I still couldn't shake this feeling of loneliness, like something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until Emma's friends had gone home that things started to feel weird. We were on the far edge of the neighborhood, where the houses were older, more spaced out. Most of them had their lights off, signaling they weren't handing out candy. but Emma insisted on hitting every single door she could find. That's when we saw him. He was standing on the sidewalk just ahead of us, under a flickering streetlight. At first, I didn't think much of it. People were out everywhere, right? But there was something about the way he stood, perfectly still, like a mannequin in a store window. He was tall, probably over 6 feet, wearing a long black trench coat that seemed too heavy for the mild October weather. His face was hidden beneath one of those cheap plastic masks you'd find at a dollar store, a white, featureless face with hollow eyes. Emma didn't seem to notice him right away, too busy skipping to the next house, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about how he just stood there watching us. My skin crawled with a strange sense of dread, like I knew something bad was about to happen. I grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her close. "Hey, let's head back. We've got enough candy." "But we haven't done that house yet," she protested, pointing to the dark, decrepit house at the corner. The porch light was off and the windows were black, like no one had lived there in years. "No one's home," I said, my voice more tense than I intended. "Come on, we're leaving." Emma pouted but didn't argue. As we turned to head back, I glanced over my shoulder. The man in the mask hadn't moved. He was still standing there, watching us. My heart began to race as we walked down the sidewalk, quickening my pace, practically dragging Emma along with me. The sound of crunching leaves under our feet was the only noise I could hear, the rest of the neighborhood oddly quiet now. "Why are we going so fast?" Emma whined, struggling to keep up. I didn't answer, my focus entirely on the figure behind us. I glanced back again and my blood ran cold. He was following us. Not running, not even walking fast, just a slow, deliberate pace, his long coat swaying with each step. The streetlight above him flickered again, casting his shadow long and distorted on the sidewalk. "Emma," I said, my voice shaking, "I need you to run. Now." She looked at me with wide eyes, sensing the fear in my voice. "Why? What's wrong? Just run, okay? Don't look back. Go straight home." Emma took off without another word, her small feet pounding against the pavement as she sprinted down the street. I stayed behind for a second, staring at the man, trying to gauge if he was really coming for us or if I was just being paranoid. But then he picked up his pace. The calm, slow walk turned into something more determined. His strides lengthened, closing the distance between us faster than I expected. Panic surged through me, and I bolted, sprinting after Emma as fast as I could. The houses around me blurred, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I couldn't hear him, but I didn't need to. I knew he was getting closer. We cut through yards and down side streets, trying to lose him in the maze of suburban houses. But every time I glanced back, he was there, closer, relentless, like he was playing some twisted game of cat and mouse. My legs burned, but the fear pushed me forward. Emma was still ahead of me, and I couldn't let anything happen to her. I couldn't let him get to her. We finally reached our house. Emma burst through the front door, slamming it behind her. I stumbled in right after, locking the door with shaking hands. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. "What's going on?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Who was that man?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to explain what I didn't understand. All I knew was that he was still out there. I peeked through the small window beside the door, expecting to see him standing at the end of the driveway. But the street was empty. He was gone. For a moment, I let myself believe we were safe. Maybe he'd lost interest. Maybe he'd found someone else to follow. But then a knock. A slow, deliberate knock echoed from the front door, the sound vibrating through the wood, through my bones. I stepped back, pulling Emma with me as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. And then, a voice, software muffled. "I know you're in there." It wasn't the voice of a monster or a villain from a horror movie. It was calm. polite, friendly even. But that only made it worse. I stumbled back further, dragging Emma with me as we retreated into the living room, the knocking still echoing through the house. "I know you can hear me." The voice was right outside the door now. The doorknob rattled, and I felt my stomach twist in knots. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911. But when I put the phone to my ear, the line was dead. No dial tone, no signal. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the house, heavy and suffocating. Emma clung to my side, her face pale and scared. For a few moments I thought maybe he had left, but then from somewhere inside the house, I heard the floor creak. He was already inside. The next breath I took felt like swallowing ice. The creak echoed through the house like a death sentence. I froze, every muscle tensing as my eyes darted around the room. How could he have gotten inside? The doors were locked, the windows were shut. But none of that mattered now because he was here. Somewhere. I grabbed Emma's hand, pulling her close as we backed further into the living room. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. My parents' party was still going on in the backyard, but the music was too loud. They wouldn't hear us if we screamed. We were on our own. Another creak, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room. I spotted the hall closet, the one we used to store winter coats. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it was all we had. I motioned to Emma to stay quiet and hurried her over, opening the door just wide enough for both of us to slip inside. We crouched low, pressing ourselves against the back wall behind the coats, trying to make ourselves as small as possible. The darkness of the closet felt suffocating, but it was better than the alternative. I could hear Emma's shaky breaths, and I squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her, though I was just as terrified. My mind raced with questions. Who was this man? Why was he following us? And how did he get inside? The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. I strained my ears, trying to figure out where he was, but it was impossible to tell. My breaths came out in shallow gasps, my heart beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then the door to the living room creaked open. I clamped my hand over Emma's mouth as she let out a small gasp. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy boots hitting the floor, one step at a time. He was in the room, moving closer. I could hear him breathing, slow and steady, like he wasn't in a rush, like he had all the time in the world. The sound of his footsteps stopped right in front of the closet. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying he wouldn't open the door. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed to the point of pain. The only thing separating us from him was a thin wooden door and a row of coats. For a moment, everything went silent again. Maybe he hadn't noticed us. Maybe. The door handle rattled. My heart stopped as the door slowly creaked open. Light flooded into the closet, blinding me for a second. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The door opened wider and I saw him, the man in the mask. His head tilted to the side as he stared down at us, the hollow eyes of the plastic mask fixed on me. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. I could feel Emma trembling beside me, her tiny hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. "Please," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. "Please don't hurt her." The man's head tilted the other way like he was studying us, deciding what to do. His silence was worse than any threat he could have made. It was like he was savoring the fear, feeding off it. And then, without warning, he reached out. I flinched, pulling Emma behind me, trying to shield her from him. But he didn't touch us. Instead, he grabbed the door and slowly, deliberately, closed it. The click of the door shutting was deafening in the silence. I sat there, my body trembling, waiting for the footsteps to start again, waiting for him to come back. But the house remained eerily quiet. I held Emma close, listening, waiting for any sign that he was still there. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Finally, I mustered the courage to crack the door open, peering out into the living room. It was empty. The house was silent. There was no sign of him, no sign he'd ever been there. I slowly led Emma out of the closet, both of us shaking with fear. I checked every room, every door, every window. Everything was locked. There was no way he could have gotten in. No way he could have left without us hearing him. But he had been there. The phone signal returned an hour later. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of the man in the mask, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Nothing. They said it was probably a Halloween prank, maybe a neighbor playing a trick on us. But I knew better. I knew the way he'd watched us, the way he'd followed us. That wasn't a prank. It was a warning. Even now, months later, I can still hear his voice sometimes. Late at night, when the house is quiet and I'm alone, I hear it. I know you're in there, and I know one day he'll come back. Halloween had always been the one night of the year when my friends and I felt like we ruled the town. Even though we were getting older, around 16 now, we weren't ready to give up the thrill of Halloween just yet. It wasn't about trick-or-treating anymore. We were too old for that. But the excitement of staying out late, wandering the streets, and pulling harmless pranks. This year, we decided we'd hit up the abandoned part of town, the old neighborhood just outside the city limits that everyone called Black Hollow. No one really went there anymore. Most of the houses had been empty for years, their windows boarded up, yards overgrown, and streets littered with cracked asphalt. Black Hollow had its own stories, rumors of squatters, addicts, and worse, but to us it was just the perfect spot for some Halloween mischief. There were 5 of us, me, Chris, Danny, Nate, and Tyler. We'd been friends since grade school, practically inseparable. Chris was the planner, always coming up with the wildest ideas, and tonight was no different. He dared us to walk the length of Black Hollow, from one end to the other, without chickening out. "You can't tell me you guys are scared of a few old houses," Chris said with a grin, adjusting the devil horns he'd stuck onto his head as a half-hearted costume. "I thought you wanted something to actually scare you this Halloween." "I'm in," Nate said, shrugging like it was no big deal. Danny was hesitant but nodded. "As long as it's quick, all right?" "I don't want to be out here all night." Tyler just smirked, always the quiet one, always along for the ride. I wasn't as sure. Something about the place had always unsettled me, even when I'd heard the stories as a kid. The darkened streets, the silent houses. It felt like the past had frozen there, like time didn't work the same way in Black Hollow. But I wasn't about to back out. "Let's just get it over with," I said, stuffing my hands into my jacket pockets as we started walking down the cracked sidewalk, the cold October air biting at my face. The streetlights were few and far between, most of them flickering or completely out. The further we walked, the darker it got. At first it was fine, just the usual banter and jokes to keep ourselves from getting too creeped out. The houses loomed like shadows, their windows black holes staring at us. A couple of times we heard strange noises, but it was probably just animals, or so we told ourselves. But about halfway down the block, things started to feel different. That's when we saw him. Standing at the far end of the street, under the one working streetlight, was a man. At least I thought it was a man. He was tall, unnaturally tall, dressed head to toe in black. His face was hidden under the brim of a wide black hat, the kind you'd see in old movies. He wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still as if he was waiting for something. Or someone. Chris stopped in his tracks, and we all followed suit, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. What's this guy supposed to be? A scarecrow or something? No way, Nate said, his voice low, almost afraid to be too loud. He's just standing there. The man didn't move, not a twitch. I couldn't make out any details of his face in the shadows, but something about him felt wrong, like he wasn't supposed to be there, like he was watching us. Let's just turn around, I muttered, the unease growing inside me. The others weren't saying anything now either, all of us staring at this figure in the distance. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't shifted an inch, but the air around us felt heavy, suffocating. No way, Chris said, though his voice was quieter now. We just walked past him, probably some loser pulling a Halloween prank. I didn't want to walk past him. Something inside me screamed to turn back, to run, but I couldn't say that. Not to Chris, not to the guys. So we kept walking, slower now, the tension between us rising with each step. As we got closer, I realized he wasn't just tall. He was towering. His coat billowed slightly in the breeze, but still he remained motionless. And then, as we got within maybe 20 feet of him, something changed. His head tilted just a fraction, like he was acknowledging us for the first time. Keep moving, Chris whispered, though I could hear the fear in his voice now. Don't look at him. We tried. We really did. But as we passed, something about the man drew my eyes. I couldn't help it. I glanced up just for a second. His face was still hidden beneath the hat, but there was something wrong with his skin, pale like wax, almost too smooth. His hands hung at his sides, the fingers impossibly long, like they could wrap around my whole neck. My stomach churned as I quickened my pace, trying to get away from him, and that's when he started following us. At first it was just the sound, soft footsteps, too soft for someone his size. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, he was walking now, slowly, deliberately, keeping pace with us. His head was still slightly tilted, and even though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew he was watching me. "Guys," I whispered, but they already knew. We all heard it, the steady rhythm of his footsteps echoing through the empty street. "Just keep walking," Chris said through gritted teeth, his bravado completely gone now. "Don't let him scare you." But it wasn't just fear anymore. It was something deeper, more primal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt cold all over, like his presence was draining the warmth from the air. Every step he took felt like it was pulling us deeper into some kind of trap, like we were being lured into a nightmare we couldn't escape. We picked up our pace, nearly jogging now, but he didn't fall behind. His footsteps grew louder, faster, keeping perfect time with ours. The panic hit me full force, my heart slamming against my chest. "He's still coming," Danny hissed, glancing over his shoulder, his face pale. "What the hell is wrong with him?" "I don't know, just run." Chris finally broke into a sprint, and we all followed, our sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement. We cut through yards, jumped fences, anything to put distance between us and that thing. But he never stopped. Every time I dared to glance back, he was there, moving faster now, impossibly fast, his long legs carrying him toward us like he was gliding over the ground. The hat stayed low, hiding his face, but I could feel his gaze on me, like icy fingers crawling up my spine. We were almost out of Black Hollow, the streetlights of the main road just a block away. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, but I didn't care. All that mattered was getting away from him. Finally, we burst onto the main road, where cars drove by, oblivious to what had just happened. I doubled over, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. The others were just as shaken, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. I looked back, expecting to see him right behind us, but the man in black was gone. Just like that. "Where did he go?" Nate panted, looking around wildly. "He was right there. He was—" "I don't know," Chris muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I don't care. Let's just go home." None of us argued. We walked back, not speaking, not daring to look back at Black Hollow. But the fear stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, tall, looming, faceless, and even now I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, somewhere in Black Hollow, waiting for the next group of kids to cross his path. And if we'd stayed just a little longer, what would have happened? What could have happened?